how do I both kind of honor the guest story, but also share my own expertise without being like, well, let me tell you about me, or, like making the podcast about me or interjecting and interrupting their stories. And so, how do we figure out how to do an interview podcast that isn't just me asking questions and not being able to share? Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and today we're marking a huge milestone with a special episode. It's our 1-year anniversary. Over the past year, we've shared stories of authenticity at work, explored what it means to navigate work and life on your terms, and learned alongside some pretty amazing guests. To celebrate this moment, I'm actually handing over the reins. Today, interviewing me is the founder of Nova, who's the production company behind this podcast, Hayden Lyon. In this episode, we go behind the scenes to dive into the inspiration behind Working Your Way and the process of creating each episode. And we talk about how this podcast reflects my own journey of working my way. I'm excited to share this conversation with you as we reflect on 1 year of Working Your Way and have a couple of laughs in the process. So before we dive in, I also would love to say, I want to hear your thoughts. Please email me, message me on social media, and let me know what you think about the show. Tell me what's been helpful for you or what you'd love to hear more about. Okay, without further ado, here is Hayden and me talking all things Working Your Way. Okay, well, I am going to welcome you to Working Your Way and hand over the reins because we're going to do a little special episode here.
I was going to welcome you to Working Your Way. So it's okay. We can do that.
Well, now that I've handed over the reins, I think that's appropriate.
Of course.
But before I hand it over the reins, not appropriate.
Yeah, true. So, Sandhya, welcome to Working Your Way. On here we talk
Thanks.
about well, you're welcome.
Tell me.
We talk about a variety of things. It's a very, very good show, expertly produced, might I say. So, what I want to talk to you about today, genuinely, is the show. I want to have a little bit of a peek behind the scenes for the listeners, which is always fun. But also, there's a couple of questions I have as to the show, really. Well, let's start off. Let's start off super general as well. This is a very general question. What made you decide to start a podcast? As I said, very general question, but what do you think?
I thought you were going to be like, what is your name? We're going to go a little more specific than that. Great. So yes, I decided to start a podcast. And what's interesting about this is I kind of knew that I wanted to have a podcast for a while, probably at least a year, maybe a little longer before I actually started one or got on a call with you one day. And part of that decision was thinking about what it is that I really enjoy. I think ultimately in this kind of solopreneurial world, it's important to get your thoughts and your ideas and who you are out into the world in some way in order to, generate interest in business and clients and things like that, right? So on one hand, it can be a marketing tool, but for me, I think I have this kind of stupid level of hopefulness that I walk around the world with, and I wanted to help people like have some kind of tool, something tangible that they could use and reference to see that work can be better than it is right now. And I just really truly believe like we can be happier and healthier and still be ambitious and successful, but like do it in a way that isn't so hard. And I wanted to find a way to share stories with people about how you can make that actually happen, because we can talk about it, but what do I go do, right?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I really like hearing that side of the goal, because too often we can think about goals of, podcasts or blogs or whatever it is that we're doing of, I am doing this to increase this number. And then by the increasement of that number, I can do this and what have you. But there is that other side to it, which is kind of difficult to talk about. It shouldn't be. But what I mean by that is you want to help people in the way that you want to help people, in the way that you're very good at helping people, to maybe recontextualize things and then help them with that type of thing. Okay. Now that's good. And that's a very, very, obviously a very, very good goal. I've found that it's hard to talk about those things because maybe I'm cynical, but I rarely believe when people say that. Do you know what I mean? I wanted to build this that happens to be a good funnel for my business because I want to help people. You know what I mean? Am I cynical or what's going on there?
I think coming from somebody who like generally believes the good in people,
Yeah.
you might be a little bit cynical, but I will say that I think it's like fairly transparent when somebody just wants to create content for creating content's sake or just wants to get people on their email list. Like I feel like there's all these lead generation, avenues that you can take as a coach or, consultant. And when it feels so transactional, like I don't know, I can feel it. And I think, you know, that's probably where you're sitting. And the interesting thing is like I'm quite a methodical person, which I think and I like to call it intentional, right? And that I don't do things without a purpose. I don't do things before I feel like I know what role they might play. And the podcast really honestly was not. I mean, at this point, it's like it didn't play a specific role in my business strategy other than to allow me to get my thoughts and ideas out into the world in a way that I actually enjoy doing it, because there's a lot of ways to share your knowledge with the world, writing and LinkedIn and blogging and, speaking and podcasting, all these things, right? And so for me, I just really have always loved and do in my business a lot have deep conversations with people. So the podcast was a way to combine something that I really love to do with a way that I can share my thoughts and ideas with the world.
That makes sense. And it's interesting you mention, well, working your way. And the podcast is the way that you would prefer to get your ideas out there. Now, when it comes to working your way with that, is it because that's the way you enjoy to do those things? Is it because it's one of the better ways to do those things? Is it because it's aligned with your strengths? Is it all of those things?
I will say, I think there's no right or wrong way to market a business or to share your ideas. I think it is truly coming back to like what works for you. Because I think when somebody follows the formula of do 18 outreach emails a day and, get people on this list or share this, PDF with people or whatever it is, right? That's when it starts to become transparently transactional. I think that's kind of the thing, right? Is like when people are following if I do X, Y, and Z, I'll get rich or I'll get this many clients or all whatever. They're not working in a way that they actually like have a passion and energy and an interest in. And I think you could tell, right, when that's happening. So I think there's not a right or a wrong way. It truly is like what way works for you, right? And I mean, clearly that's like such a big theme of the podcast. And so for me, I like to talk, right? Like writing feels really hard for me. And so that's one thing that I knew kind of early on was like, man, when I sit down to write something, like I feel like I'm struggling. Like I sit there and even doing things solo, which, I'm sure we'll talk about, but like doing a solo podcast episode is hard for me. But I say way smarter things and way more interesting things. And I have more of a personality when I'm in conversation with somebody. And I knew that about myself and I observed that about myself. And so it's like, why wouldn't I share my ideas in conversation with people? And what better way to do that than do it in a podcast and record it?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's real. I think the whole thing of working away is super interesting to me. And I know we're not necessarily talking about the podcast right now, but it's super interesting to me. And we've talked a little bit, if we can go off on a tangent for a little bit. We've talked before about what it is and what it isn't. working away? And obviously it could mean different things to different people, but I think there's underpinned ideas in there. And we've talked a little bit, I think I've asked you before about the concept of dharma in Hinduism and how it may or may not be similar / different, and how that's how I was trying to conceptualize it within my head,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know whether it was a very fruitful endeavor, to be fair. What do you think about that?
How many of our conversations become fruitful endeavors, Hayden? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Some of them go down a rabbit hole and
Some
they just stay. That's fine. But I think, so this idea of dharma is like it's purpose, right? It's your life purpose, your soul's purpose. Like, what are you on this planet in this lifetime to do? And I think it can be such a daunting idea to be like, you've got to figure out what your life's purpose is. What's your soul's purpose on this earth? Like, I don't know, like, how am I supposed to figure that out? I just like went to college and got a job and, like, but I do think there is some tie into working your way in the sense of like, one of the big questions that I think leads us to understanding how we can work our way is like, what is the unique value that you bring into every room just by being you, not by the books you've read or the skills that you've acquired or the, classes that you've gone to or any of that stuff, right? What you deliver, what you create in Excel and PowerPoint, but like, what do you just do naturally, inherently well? And that talent that you bring into the room, you can use that in a lot of different ways, and maybe it's that talent that's kind of the important thing. And then you figure out how you want to apply that talent, whether it's with certain groups or in certain industries or not even at work. It could be with your family or your loved ones. And so something like that is, I think, understanding those things about ourselves gets us one step closer to kind of understanding what our purpose is. And not to say we need to figure out what our life's purpose is, in order to like live a good life. I think it's, how are you showing up in a way that works for you, that is like intrinsically just valuable to other people, right? And it's in service of other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's less of finding your true purpose, etc. But maybe if you are working in the job, you can still work in that job your way and bring your authenticity to that. That's really interesting. I'll leave that tangent for a while. I'm sure we'll come back to it. But back to the podcast. So let's be picturing the scene here. So we were thinking about starting a podcast, but weren't really ready yet. Weren't really there. And then eventually,
yes,
it was the time is now. Now, when the time was now, before we started ideating or anything like that, do you remember what you envisioned for the podcast when you thought about what it looked like or sounded like or how it was, the structure? What was that?
Yeah. And let me say too, just to back up a second, like, why did I not start it a year and a half before I actually did? And for me, I think I've always been quite I could figure anything out kind of a person. I built my own website. I've done a lot of the stuff in my business myself and just like, what do they call it? Bootstrapped it and looked it up and Googled it and watched some YouTube videos and figured out how to do it. And some of those things I think were a valuable use of my time because they allowed me to like formulate thoughts and ideas about like what it is I want to do and how I want to talk about it. And when it comes to a podcast, I was like, could I record a podcast? Could I figure out how to edit the sound and edit the videos and create content out of it? Absolutely. I could figure that out. And I knew that I didn't want to figure it out. I didn't think that that was a good like trade-off for my time. And so the reason that I waited was honestly to get to a point in my business where I was bringing in enough money where I could actually pay someone else to do the work of like bringing the podcast to life. Like and this is truly like, this is working your way, right? It's like, how do you leverage the things that you're really good at? You do what you do really well and you delegate the rest of the stuff, right? Or you partner or collaborate on the rest of the stuff. And I think that was important to me to wait until the point where I wasn't feeling like I had to do it all myself because I knew that would end up taking a ton of time. It'd be cheaper, but is that like, what's the trade-off, right? What's the trade-off in all the energy that I would have been putting into to creating it when I could be doing what I actually do really well
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
find ways to bring in revenue from that.
Is that the biggest benefit, do you reckon, of hiring out for the podcast? Is that the biggest benefit that is it a time-based thing, or is it that you can concentrate on your own thing and therefore work your way, etc.?
I think it's one of the benefits. And I think it depends
Mm.
on how, for somebody who might want to start a podcast, there's like many different levels of support, right? Where it's like you could just pay somebody a much smaller amount of money, have them do the tactical sound editing, whatever you tell them kind of how you want it to turn out. Great, produce it. Like that feels it's a little more transactional, and not in a bad way, just in a this is what I'm going after, right? And when I met with you, so we'll take a second just to, talk about our first meeting. The collaboration for me was like really exciting. Like I met with a couple of people to, talk about like different ways or different companies that I could work with and things like that. And I think um you one were super enthusiastic about my vision. I think that's just like the kind of person that you are. You like champion whatever topic people want to talk about, like even if it's like quite obscure, which sometimes it is.
Yeah.
And we had a good dialogue and a good kind of ideating session around what it is that I wanted to put out into the world and what it would look like and how it would be structured. And, even before we really ideated as a team. So
Mm.
for me, outsourcing production on a podcast can be, I get the sound editing, the video editing, the content creation. But in this instance with Nova, I have thought partners. I have people that make my ideas better, or we can kind of come together and be more innovative than we could by ourselves. So and it's interesting because I work with teams all the time, right? That's like the core of my business, is like helping teams work better together and build a culture and communicate and all that stuff. And I don't have my own team, and so I also like this solopreneur life is like kind of lonely sometimes, right? I have a great
Yeah.
network of entrepreneur friends, but it's so nice to have, like, to feel like, part of a team that's creating something and everybody wants it to be as successful as I do. And that's like, it's not something that I have right now, right? Except for in this podcast. And I think that's like also a really fun thing for me, is like, oh, I feel like I have a team again. We get to create something together. So,
Yeah, that's interesting.
and so like, in that meeting, I walked into it thinking I knew I wanted to tell stories. So I wanted to talk about people's stories because that's like the most fascinating thing to me. I love humans. I love the idea of like, how did you become the person that you are? Like, how did you get here? What contributed to that? And I think right now, especially for folks that work like in organizations, there's this like, oh, I'm looking at these people on LinkedIn or on this panel or at the top of my org chart in my company. And I see like they're doing great and they're super successful. Like, oh my God, I could never get there. And I think for me, it was like, no. You can get there, and you could do it in a way that like isn't going to feel awful every day of the process to get there, because they didn't start there either. Like they've gone through struggles and they've had tough times and they've had to navigate that, and they came out on the other end of that in this like great place. But I wanted to highlight, and it sounds kind of negative, it's funny, but like I wanted to highlight like it's a journey, right? To get here, to be authentic in your job, to have a job that you love, to be really good at it, and to feel confident about that. It's a journey to get there. Let's go on the journey with these guests. And the one kind of big challenge that I walked into that meeting with you offered up this challenge to us collectively is, okay, that means I'm interviewing people on my podcast. Great. I'm excited to have these conversations. And how do I both kind of honor the guest story, but also share my own expertise without being like, well, let me tell you about me, or, like making the podcast about me, or interjecting and interrupting their stories, because I think, uh, that didn't feel like it served the purpose of sharing tools, the tools and the resources and all the things that I've learned along the way. And so it's kind of like, what's going to help the listener and also honor the guest and their story. And so how do we figure out how to do an interview podcast that isn't just me asking questions and not being able to share? So that was like the problem, right, that we had to kind of go solve for.
Yeah, because it was, I remember that because it was all about, I really respected this, it was all about making it more valuable for the listener, you know? And that's I think what we landed on with the structure. And it's interesting because I would say, you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong, but I would say a lot of, maybe most of, the compliments received are about the structure and the way the podcast is, and it's all of its differentiators, how it's different. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the feedback that I'm hearing, right? And of course, like, it's going to be a little bit of bias because those are my friends and the people that love me that tell me how they feel about the podcast. And so they're like, I think one of my friends was like, I really like the times when you play the horns and you talk about something, or, you pause the episode and you like share something or ask a question, or, and so I think, yes, the people in my life love me. And so of course they're going to compliment me, but it allows me to share what I know, right? Which was also the point of the podcast. I want to tell people stories, but I also want to share what I know. And how do you bring those two things together in a way that is generous to both the guest and the listener? And so the feedback has been great in that sense, for sure. It's like, I think what I've heard from people is it gives me like some space to breathe. It gives me a moment to process. Like, it helps me conceptualize this thing that I just heard, or makes me think about something different. And the idea is like, how do you apply this guest's learning to your own life? Or, is there a concept in there that we can kind of break down a little bit more? And so that has been, gotten really positive feedback on that element of it.
When it comes to working your way, do you reckon it's more beneficial to do it the way we're doing it rather than solo episodes? What do you think?
For me, yes. I think the thing is, if you took me to a party, I would not be the person that's like, oh my God, let me tell you about this thing that happened to me the other day, and like go into a whole story and tell this like really compelling story. I like need to react to people. There's this like really kind of woo-woo side of me that loves astrology and all these things, but there's this tool, it's a framework or a modality, whatever you want to call it. It's called human design. And it gives you, there's certain like energy, like how are you meant to use your energy? Like, how do you use your energy in the best way possible? And one of the things in it talks about like, are you like how you think alone in a room, how you think in a group, how you think with other people, like what is your best way of like thinking and processing and like creating? And this just helped me put language to this, because it's like, mine is a collaborative style. And so, whether or not like whatever you believe in these types of tools, I think they offer us language that can help us like see things that we might not have otherwise seen. There were so many times where I'm like, okay, I'm going to write this thing, or I'm going to create this whatever presentation, or even that first solo episode for me, oh my gosh, it was painful. And actually, little known secret, Hayden made me record that first episode. Which, like, he made me re-record it. I recorded it once.
Yep.
And then he's like, yeah, so maybe you could do this one again.
It's got to be done sometimes, It
was this loving way of being like, your energy is not great in this episode. Like, you can make it a little more, you. Yeah. And that was in recognizing that, like, I do have a personality. It just doesn't show up when I'm recording solo looking at a camera, right? And so if I just wanted to get my ideas out into the world, I could do a solo podcast and just share all these tools, right? But having other people's stories is like such a good catalyst for me to like think about, oh yeah, I have a tool for that. Or oh yeah, I had a client that was dealing with something similar, like here's what happened with them, right? And so it's like, I can't just come up with these things on my own. It's just the way my brain works. And I don't think it's a bad thing or a good thing. It's just knowing that about myself helps me and helped us ideate around like, how do we get the best, product at the end of the day to share with listeners and for them to get value out of it.
Absolutely. I love that. And it's that thing of knowing yourself in so many ways is so important. And it's like, I think by talking. You know, if I've got something that's on my mind, I have to talk. Even if it's just at a wall, I need to verbalize it. And I don't know why, but knowing these things about ourselves, I guess, allows us to, I'm not going to say work your way, allows us to, it allows us to do loads of things, to be more authentic, to be more productive, to be more in line with what we kind of maybe should be doing. That's really interesting that it's really meta as well, that during the ideation of this podcast, it was about knowing yourself. Like, that's really interesting.
I mean, it is and it isn't, right? This is like what I stand for. It's like,
Yeah,
it's who I
it's true.
am, you know, in my business and outside of my business. Like before I even started my business, people, you know, my friends would be like, you're always learning something new about yourself. And then you share it. And I learned something new about myself. Like that's just, you know, it's like
Yeah.
who I've always been. And I think if I were to create a podcast that wasn't utilizing the things I know about myself, that would be kind of silly, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay. We're picturing the scene again. We've ideated. We've come up with the structure of the show and how it will all work. Let's dive into how it does work, how it works on the production side of things. Let's give the listeners a bit of a sneak peek into the back end of it. So, how does it work for you? What does it involve?
It involves a lot. I will say the guest episodes are quite a lot of creation and production and handoffs and things like that. So, I mean, just even in finding my guests, I don't know, I have kind of like I need to put a framework or words to it, but like there's just something that I know that their story is going to be interesting, relatable. They're showing up authentically. You know, I think a friend of mine was referring me to a potential podcast guest once, and I said, okay, just make sure she doesn't hate her job because I will not bring someone on the podcast that hates their job, right? Like it doesn't work, right? That's not authentic to like the point of the podcast, and so even if this person would be an amazing guest, even if they have a huge following or famous or whatever, it's like that's not true to the nature of what we're trying to do here. So finding the guests, you know, that have this, I don't know, je ne sais quoi, and then I'll reach out to them. You know, we'll have a pre-call. So I do like to, well, I don't pre-plan questions or we don't kind of plot out or outline the discussion or the conversation. I do want to hear about their story and I want to hear a little bit about them. And also make sure that they understand that this podcast is not, you know, I'm not trying to like find some sensational soundbite or get, you know, it's there's no gotcha moments or there's no, you know, any of that kind of stuff too. It's like I want them to feel like they are kind of co-creating this with me and have say in what ends up in the episode. So I think partially I do this pre-call to understand their story and maybe, you know, at least put some thought into like what are the points that I think would be really interesting for people to hear more about, but also to make sure that they have this like sense of safety too. Because if you work in a big organization and you're at a high level role, like your image does matter and what you say in public that goes into, you know, the zeitgeist of content does matter. And so I always make sure my guests know that like if they say anything that they didn't mean to say, if they shared a name, we'll cut that out. If they, you know, want to start over answering a question, they could do that, you know. So we kind of establish that sense of the rapport and the safety there too. So
Interesting. Would it not be easier to write a list of questions that you're going to ask them, having researched them thoroughly, and then send them those questions so that they can prepare the answers and then get on the episode and then everything runs smoothly?
would it be easier? Possibly. Would it be interesting? I think no. And would it be fun for me? Also, no, right? Like, I think part of this process and why I don't want pre-planned questions is it's like I don't want to know where the conversation is going to go. Like sometimes I'll think it's going to cover these couple of things and we go somewhere totally different, you know, and that's like part of what, you know, again, it's like knowing myself. Like I trust myself to have like a great meaningful conversation with like anybody. Like I could go pull somebody off the sidewalk and like learn about their life and learn about their childhood and how it impacts them today and all that stuff. Like it's something that I do, right? It's something I love to do. And so to pre-plan questions just feels kind of like limiting. It feels boring, honestly, also.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we do kind of keep it open-ended. And sometimes people ask, and I tell them that I don't pre-plan the questions, but I'll give them like, okay, we're going to talk about how you are showing up authentically, when it was hard for you, and what you did to get from point A to point B. What are the tools that you use, or what helps you? And so those are the 3 points we hit on in every episode, but there's no like specific questions around those. I might
Mm.
have like a starting point, but
Yeah. Yeah.
so
I always find
yeah.
it super interesting when someone's got we've seen it before, when someone's got specific questions in a big list that they're going to ask to this podcast guest, and then at some point in the interview the podcast guest will answer, oh yeah, that's when I got my world record for balancing a beach ball on my head, and then next year, and like they just don't talk about it. That's not on the questions, leave that there. You know what I mean? They just don't come back
Yeah.
to it. But yeah, it's funny because they're stringently following it.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, like every guest, and I didn't, this isn't something I necessarily knew before going into this, but like I quickly realized like every guest has their own energy. They have their own like pace and cadence and how they talk. And some of them are storytellers and some of them are like, okay, I'm going to answer the question and wait for the next question. Right. And so it's like, it's actually like a fun thing for me to just kind of like adapt to the person and their style of sharing about themselves, and navigate that and know that like there's still topics that we'll want to cover, or information that I would love them to share, but we're going to do it slightly differently every time.
Mm, Is it? I think it's interesting because that for me at least creates the best value for the listener by having the conversation that open and stuff like that, right? And it's also your preferred way of working because of your strengths and what you enjoy and everything like that. We're seeing that a lot, right? Is it is it a coincidence that the way that you like to work and the way and where your strengths lie produces the best value for the listener, or is it that you're working your way that the best value is produced?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence, and I don't think I would be doing what I do if I believed it was a coincidence, right? I think that's the idea behind leveraging your talents and your natural way of being to create the most impact. Like that's kind of, that's the point. It's like, how do we create more impact in the world? Whether it's in your job or with the people that you love or in your community or whatever, wherever you do that with less effort, right? And not even like, I mean, I do think sometimes I'm lazy and I like to sleep a lot, but like most people looking from the outside would say that's not true. But like from the inside, I'm like, I want to work as little as possible and sleep as much as possible. But all of that said, it's like we get more impact for the effort that we put in, right? When we are doing things our way, when there's this natural like generation of energy around what we're passionate about and how we like to work. I think we drain a lot of energy trying to do things the way that other people have done them. And because it fine, that worked for that person, great. Like if someone else stepped in, had a meeting with you and was like, I want to do this podcast exactly how she's doing it, I'd be like, don't, because that might not be your thing, right? It may actually be really hard for you to do this way. And so, yeah, the idea is like, how do we maximize our impact with like less effort, less struggle, less stress, less overwhelm, less whatever, and so it's more sustainable. It's a more sustainable way of living.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. Eliminating the friction of the things that aren't necessary in the first place. I love that. Okay, so
Yeah. Yeah.
we've done the interview. We've recorded the interview. You've given it to us. What's next?
Yeah. So I will typically, when I send over the files, and I'm doing a little bit of this less now, but like before in the first 35 episodes, like I would do the interview, full interview. I would re-listen to the entire interview and make tons of notes, and like whether it's edits or ideas for the narrations, which are the parts that, where I kind of interject and um pause the episode to share something. and send all of that in. Now what I do is less, I go through it less, but I will write down my ideas of, oh, I want to talk about this here. I want to talk about this here. You know, as an example, like if someone was sharing about, um, you know, hating their job and going home and sitting, like all they had energy to do was sit in front of the TV and, you know, eat their dinner every night after work. I might be like, oh, okay, that's burnout. Like, let's talk about burnout at that moment, right? And let's pause it there. And so, whatever the topics are, the things or the thoughts that come up, or even just like concepts that I think um, are worth breaking down and pausing to talk about. So I'll come up with my list of things, and then Sean, who is kind of the main editor, will go through the episode. He'll edit for pace and interest and all of the things. Like, of course, I'm like emotionally attached to every episode and everything that everybody says, and and
Mm-hmm.
also Sean gets to put the ear on it of like what's going to be interesting and helpful and valuable for the guest, and where might we have gone on a tangent. I'm sure he's going to cut half of what we're going to talk about out, which is great, because
Is
someone
it
needs
though?
to do it. You and I might love every second of it, but Sean's
Yeah.
be like, that's kind of boring, or that's it's not
Is
relevant.
this not a 3-hour episode? Can it not be?
Exactly. For the sake of the listener, we won't put all 4 hours of this episode online,
I'm just going
but
to reference jokes that we made earlier in the show so that it can't be cut out. I'm
so
going to do
he
it
has
in
to keep it
serious
in.
moments too. Yeah.
That's great. You're like, that was really good. Now I'm going to talk about the camel horse analogy.
Yeah, exactly, right? See, now you've said that, we can't cut this bit out, and we can't cut the bit out before. There we go. There we go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, he'll go through and edit it, and then he'll, you know, add in, okay, here's actually a moment where you transition topics. This would be a good place for you to add a narration. So he'll add on to my list, or, you know, if I'm like, I don't know, what would be interesting? Like some episodes I'm like, I'm just tired, you know, or my brain's
Mm.
not working as well as I would like to. And so I'm like, Sean, tell me where you think we need to have an interjection. And so he does that. He sends it back to me. I kind of write out a little more detail on my thoughts. I record those little pieces, including the intro and the wrap up and any resources or books or articles I want to share. And then I send it back, and it gets all put together and assembled. And then it goes through sound editing, and it goes then gets like reviewed for content creation. We write up the show notes, the description. Sean writes up the show notes and the description, pulls out clips, pulls out other content, and that gets created into like our social media content and the videos. And then Charlie goes through and does the full videos, and I'm reviewing these and approving them as the stages go along. And then everything gets published by Nika and Vanessa and gets put online and goes out into the world. So yeah, it's quite a production, which is exactly what it's supposed to be, right?
Well, yeah, and it felt like a test then when you were reeling off what happens. Like it was like, how does your car work? And it's like, I don't know, I just put the gas in and it goes. Like it, I don't know how it works. You know? But I love that you know every single step that we do. We do have some clients where they go, I don't know, we just send you the files. I don't know what you do, which is fine. But they're working their way.
Yes, and as you know, I'm very involved as a client, which, you know, as far as your team has told me, you guys like that I'm involved. So that's great. I'm just going to choose to believe that.
Good. I was going to say poker face right here. That's all good. Cool. Yes. So right now we've started the what's it called? The labels series. At least I've been calling it, which I'm really enjoying. Primarily because I really feel like I have given myself all of these labels, and so for me it's really valuable. But yeah, I'm finding them really interesting. How did that come about?
It came about both from a, I guess, tactical need and a, a creative need, I think. You know, we were doing the guest episodes like every episode, and then eventually started doing them every episode except for the first week of the month where we do the career questions episodes. And it's hard. I mean, it's a lot of work, right? I think at the end of the day, I love having these conversations, and, kind of all the handoffs and the reviewing and the creation of it's quite a workload. And so um, I think my ask was like, how can we do some things also when, you have busy, important people on your podcast? Like sometimes they have conflicts that come up or they have to cancel at the last minute. And so what I wanted to do was I never wanted to feel like I was chasing a deadline and have to put something out that felt like just okay, or like I'm gonna like bring a guest on that I feel just kind of like lukewarm about. Like again, it kind of
Mhm.
goes back to this like authenticity and the integrity of what I want to create. And so I was like, help. And, one of the ideas was, okay, record a bunch of solo episodes so that we can sprinkle those in and just have something that feels lower effort, lower workload, but like still is really valuable for the listener. And I, again, despise and dread doing solo episodes because it feels like a slog to me. It's hard. It's a lot of work. I don't feel like it actually represents my personality the way that I would want to represent my personality. And so it actually doesn't feel like me. And so we kind of brainstormed a little bit about like what could be some other things. Like, do you have conversations with other people? Do you bring on a co-host? Do you what do you talk about? What would be the topics? And I think one of the ones that came up during that was like I was sharing with you how I love I love reality TV. I mean, I'll just admit it, it's fine.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I love reality TV because it's like a study in human behavior, right? It's like you can watch people and watch what they do in the decisions that they make, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, you're doing that because of that thing, or like you should probably talk to your therapist about that, And so, um, like I think I exchanged voice notes with a couple of my good friends about these things, right? We'll watch the episode and we'll like break it down, all of the psychological challenges that this person might be going through in a 4-minute voice note to each other, and have a whole conversation right over the course of a couple of days. And so this voice note topic kind of was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like that would be cool. What if you just like published your voice notes? And I was like, about the reality TV, I think no, maybe in the future. Like
Yeah, I think
you
yes.
literally were
Let's
like, let's
definitely do that.
exactly. Like
100%.
you,
If you
you
listen to
like
this,
to do
listeners, which you are, if you're listening to this and you want to hear Sandra's remarks on all of the reality TV, let's make it happen. Send her an email. Let's make it happen.
Exactly. If I get like 4 emails that say people want to hear it, that's all. It's a low bar because I don't think
Yeah.
that people want to hear
I
it.
mean, we can
However,
go lower. Let's do one. I'll be
it can't come
creating
from
email
you.
addresses. Yeah.
Yeah, it can't come from exactly. It needs to come from a verified real human.
Not Hayden at gmail.com.
But yeah, so that was kind of one thing that came up. And then I was like, I kind of like this voice note idea. And also this, I don't know, it was like something that was coming up a lot for me of like, people would be like, well, I'm a people pleaser, so I do this, or I'm a perfectionist, so I do this. And so I was noticing how people kind of like really attach to these labels. And sometimes it's something that helps them feel like I'm a part of something bigger than myself. Like, yeah, oh, there's a lot of people pleasers out there. Like, we're all like united, right? We can support each other and like cheer each other on. And sometimes people are using it as a like, oh, well, I can't bring up confrontation because I'm a people pleaser. And it's like, well, are like you could make
Mm.
a different choice, right? And that's a lot of the work that I do is kind of helping people recognize what those patterns are that are maybe not serving them, or not serving those around them, and how to start to change those things. And so it kind of came together in that sense of like, in the work I do with Enneagram, it's like there's 9 different ways that people please, right? And
Mm.
people please. and and we all do it in a different way, and we might all call it the same thing, but it's not the same thing every time, and it's not coming from the same reason every time. And so what if we actually like broke down all these different ways that people identify with these labels and hear from different individuals, and have a conversation about it? And then decided to bring in a co-host because again, I was like, I don't want to do all this by myself because again, it's like not fun for me, right? Even if I'm reacting to people's voice notes, it'd be
Hmm.
more fun to do it with someone else. And so my friend Arden, who also loves to sleep. We have that in common. It's like it's the main thing that bonds us in our friendship. But she was like, yeah, and she had a podcast for a while. And so I know she likes to talk like I do. So anyway, it ended up being a good fit in that sense.
Nice. Yeah. Nice. And it's interesting because like we do seem quite informal and, you know, like we're not taking things too seriously a lot of the time, which is the way we are. It's the way we work sometimes. But then when we do kind of have that, when we need to get into the strategy, everything there is
Yeah.
purposeful. Like when we think about that type of thing, when we think about that style of
Yeah.
episode, everything about it is strategic. Like the fact that you have a co-host, the fact that it's the voice messages, the fact that it's the labels that people give. Like strategically speaking, in the future, when you're talking to a guest, that way you can, and someone says about, you know, one of these things, you can, in your narration in the future, bring it back to one of those episodes so that when someone hears that and they resonate with it, they can then go back to something that will give them all the value that they need. So it's all strategically thought out.
Yeah.
Which is just great. It's the way it should be.
And the other role that it played was these are kind of, you know, call it evergreen episodes, right? There's no like certain time that it has to be released or whatever. And so while we have planned them into the schedule, the idea then was like, I can record a bunch of them all up front. And that gives us more breathing room in the deadlines and the, you know, production plan and all of that kind of stuff, which was like, again, there's a very tactical and strategic reason for doing these episodes that I could kind of batch record, which is just something that like, you know, people listening might not think about, but it was like every bit of that was very was there for a reason, right? So.
Yeah, and I think we approach those things similarly, where we're looking for win-win-wins. You know, it's we want to be able to win by, for example, allowing you to batch record, which is just it's amazing for time, it's amazing for creativity, it's amazing for all those things, and then a win for the value of for the people listening, and just wins all over the place, you know. And it's the same with the guest episodes, because you want them to be able to have their moment of helping people and giving them the value. You can also be giving them value on the call, and then there's the listeners, and then the win-win-win is what we're always looking for. And it's interesting that can possibly be translated into what it is that you do and the people that you work with. Because working your way, I'm always going to bring it back to that. Is working your way finding the win-win-win? Because if you're working your way, it's going to be a win for you in a lot of ways. But how often is working your way a win for the person you're working for or with?
It's a good question. It's not always going to be that way. You know, I think, you know, and I've talked about this in an episode before. There's this kind of idea of job crafting. It's a kind of organizational development theory by, you know, a researcher that she found that people who were kind of doing things a little bit differently were getting a lot more fulfillment out of their jobs. And that concept is like there's a range of like how much we can kind of customize our work to us, right? And I think it depends on where you work and what kind of industry and all those things. Like for me, I have a blank slate. I am my own boss. I can say, I don't like doing that. I'm not going to ever do it again, right? Like I could wake up tomorrow and be like, I hate podcasting, which isn't going to happen. But like if I did, I could make that choice to stop doing it, right? And like it doesn't work that way if you're an accountant or a lawyer or a marketing professional, you know, an executive that needs to like do certain things, right? So I think there's ways to augment what you do in a number of different ways, whether it's what you're doing. Certainly there's stuff where it's like, I hate doing this task, but I have to do it. There's no one else on the team that can or would or make sense or responsibility for them to do it. So how could I maybe do it differently? Like maybe I do it on Fridays where I'm working in a coffee shop and I actually really love working in a coffee shop. So it makes that mundane task like less mundane. Or I'm going to actually enroll people in this process that normally I would just do this myself. But if I do it in collaboration with people, it's so much more fun. Like, so there's the what you're doing that you can augment. There's the how you do it and who you do it with. And I think those are the kinds of things where I would challenge anybody to say, I can help you find a way to make it at least 10% better than what it is now. Can I take that off of your work plan? No, right? That's not your, you don't have the autonomy to do that, but can we make it a little bit better, right? And then there's things like I'm in the wrong function or division of my company, because clearly if I like add up all these things that I really love to do and all the things that I have to do, the Venn diagram is two circles. Like there's no
Hmm.
overlap there, right? And so that's like okay, there's a fit issue with your job, right? So I think there's like a number of things that you can do along the way to say, how do I augment this task a little bit to make it better? Or how do I just like totally change careers in order to find a better fit for what I love to do and how So I think I answered your question, but I think it's not always possible to work your
Yeah.
way 100%.
Hmm.
I believe it is always possible to make a 1 or 2 or 3 or 10-degree shift.
Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. It's yes, maybe not. Oh, I was going to do a platitude. It's maybe not the destination, but it's aiming in the right way. Let's do that. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
Yeah,
sense. Okay. Now, I do
exactly.
have some quick fire questions, but I want to ask before I get to those. Is there anything I've not asked? Is there anything that we should talk about?
One thing that I guess has surprised me about the podcast that I didn't expect going in, and it's something that I'm really proud of, is I think it was probably like episode 4, which was the first episode where it wasn't like a very close personal friend of mine that came on. Because those people, of course, they're biased again. They love me, and we have lots of conversations all the time, right? But the first person that came on that wasn't in that group of people that then at the end of the episode thanked me for the conversation. That like I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was really surprised about that. And then
Mm.
it continued to happen. And it keeps happening to this day that people thank me for bringing them on my podcast because it gave them a chance to slow down and reflect and think about their story and talk about their story, make new connections that they maybe hadn't made before, or answer a question that they've never been asked before. And so I think for me, it feels very validating that like I'm doing, work that is both meaningful to me and meaningful to others, and that I'm good at this, like in a
Mm.
way that like there's something in here that is really special. And so that's been something that is like super heartwarming and also like
Yeah.
is really fulfilling. But I had no idea because I'm like, I have these people coming on who are like very important people and they're very busy and they have important executive jobs and families and all the things, right? All the life things. And yet they're thanking me for them giving me an hour and a half of their time, like, and even more with the pre-call, right? So yeah, I really love that.
Yeah, it's great. It goes back to the win-win-win as well. That's
Yeah.
what we need more of, the win-win-win. So you talked about episode 4. You talked about that happening. But I am going to
Mhm.
ask you a question that might be quite difficult. What episode are you most proud of, and why?
I'm proud of a lot of them. This is really hard
That's good.
because every single episode, I'm like I love people. I love human beings, right? I don't always want to be around them. Like you won't catch me at a music festival, but like I love to have a conversation with them one on one and learn about them and dig deeper and be more reflective. And so it's hard to say. I mean, most proud of is different than favorite. So I'm not choosing a favorite here, but I do think like some of the career questions episodes, those came up out of, I don't know, like my desire to have conversations with people like that were my friends and other solopreneurs that maybe weren't like at that time like a fit for the guest episode. So I love the personal branding episode. I think it's just like a very nuanced and valuable conversation for people. Charlie actually said she thinks the people pleaser episode might be her favorite one yet, which I was like, okay,
Congrats.
yeah. And I listened to it and I was like, you're right, this is really good. Like it's
Yeah.
fun, it's just different, the vibe is different.
Yeah.
But
Makes
every
sense.
single guest episode it has its own unique thing. And I think one that I will say, like I think it's episode 12. It's Tiffany Welton. She talks about, she's a wine bar that she opened up, and she's basically done everything that everyone in the industry said is not possible, and she's done it, and she's like incredibly successful in like turning a profit in the hospitality, the food and beverage restaurant world, like in the first year is like unheard of. And so I love to highlight the nuance of like those people's stories that are doing things that really going against the grain, and like proving that you can build a business that puts the people first and also be successful. So that's particular business model and story, I think, is like a really cool one.
Yeah, that is good. That is good. That's really interesting. I tend to agree with Charlie as well.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. So, 2 more questions, rapid fire. We're not very good at rapid fire, but it's fine.
This was not rapid at all.
Yeah, no. Incredibly slow fire. It's fine. So, penultimate. How do you feel about the response to the podcast thus far? How's it been?
I love it. I feel great about it. It feels very rewarding to be doing something that I enjoy doing, that I know that I'm good at, and that people actually value, right? That like trifecta of like, I get to do something that brings me energy, that, you know, allows me to like reach out to people and connect with people that I might not have otherwise. Like, that's pretty cool. And then I hear how people feel like it's been super helpful and insightful for them. It means a lot. And yeah, I think having more tools is great, and having them in a different format is great. I mean, you said it. It's like anyone can pick up a book and read it, but I think different ideas land for different people in different ways. And this podcast might not work for everybody, but like for the people that listen to it and like it and get value out of it in a way that they can apply to their life, I think is pretty amazing. So yeah.
Love it. Love it. Right then. Last question. Now, you don't get much opportunity to talk directly to the listeners, I would say. I mean, you kind of do when you're giving context to situations and stuff, but I mean, truly directly. So you can now. This is you now talking directly to the person who has you in their earbuds right now. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the audience listening?
Well, this latest season of Love Island was great. I will say that.
Oh, quick aside. Do you watch any of the Brazilian reality shows?
I haven't yet, but I think they have a Love is Blind season. They've got a couple.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
They're on season 4. Okay, we're starting now. They're on season 4. They've just finished season 4. And so it's basically like, they have the circle as well, but it's basically like Love is Blind,
Yeah, okay.
right?
Yep.
But everyone's kind of a bit more, a bit extra, a bit kind of, things mean more to them. You know, they said what? You know, and so it's
so like, it's a passionate culture, right?
Oh,
so
very
yeah,
much so. Yes. So for anyone that doesn't know, and I don't know why you would, I live in Brazil. My family.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's like like everyone's a bit tipsy. Do you know what I mean? Like before they filmed, everyone had a bit of a martini, and then they go, right, go. Honestly, you've got to check it out.
Okay, all right. It will be on my list for sure. Cool. Yeah, I'm into that. But yeah, okay. So in all sincereness, what I would like to say, I mean, I will talk about reality TV anytime. So, you know, just send me an email if you want to talk about that stuff. But I think, you know, and this is partially, you know, when I was 14, my dad passed away, and he was both the person that I learned through observation what it looks like to love the work that you do. He was a mechanical engineer. He designed diesel engines and was working on making them more fuel efficient and better for the environment, which is like a big task back in the 80s. But he loved his work, and I observed that through him, and also, you know, losing him at a young age, and him like recognizing that, as cliche as it sounds, that life is short. I think I also learned that like life is too precious to like waste days and weeks and years being miserable. And so I think that's largely informed my worldview as it relates to career, because it's like, you should be able to do what you love, and don't be miserable. Like, it can always be better. And it's hard to see that sometimes because I think, again, our lives are so packed with things. And it's like, how would I ever start over? How would I make this move? Or what do I even like to do? I don't even know. Right. And that was like where I kind of was in 2019 when I quit my job and before I went back to school in the pandemic and started the business and all the things. But it was like, I was like, I know what I don't want to do. And it's what I'm doing right now. And so, how do I figure out what I do want to do? And not everybody has the means or the desire to take 7 months off and just be self-indulgent and like learn about themselves and figure that stuff out and build a business. But there's always something that can be better. There's always a way. And so, yeah, hopefully this podcast helps people recognize that there are small shifts that you can make, but also like, if you want to make the big shift, like it's possible and you could do it. So yeah.
It's beautiful. That's why we do the podcast. That's beautiful. That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Right. That's the end of my questions. That's interview over. You've got the job. You can continue to do the podcast.
I'm hired. I'm hired as a client. You're not going to
sure.
fire me. That's great. That's great.
Absolutely. No, it was.
What do you have to say about the podcast? I mean, you've said some things as we've gone through, but I'm really curious about what is your favorite thing about the podcast? Your least favorite thing about the podcast?
Oh, okay.
What are you most
difficult.
Curious about? Tell me something.
Oh, okay. Okay. My favorite thing is the structure and the elasticity of the structure. We have a very nice one as it is, but we've shown that it can change depending on other things that need to happen. So, for example, the labels episodes, we came up to something where we're like, okay, we need to solve for these issues. How can we do that? And what we came out of that conversation with was, in my opinion, I enjoy that structure more. I'll just say that.
Yeah, it's funny.
But yeah, so that structure, it's this word gets thrown about. It's creative, but it's not creative for creative's sake. It's intentional. So I really enjoy that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.